Hello, everyone. Welcome to Race, Ethnicity, and the Financial Lives of Young Adults. My name is Jonathan Likes. I am the Director of Programs and Partnerships for the GenForward Survey and Black Youth Project. I want to just take a moment to let all of our panelists introduce ourselves, and then we will get started. So let's start with Vlad.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vlad Medenica. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Delaware, and I'm also a research consultant at the GenForward Survey.
Uzma, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Uzma Amin. I'm an associate at the Financial Health Network, and my background is in healthcare. And looking forward to talking with all of you today.
Thank you. Fahad?
Hello, everybody. My name is Fahad Karashi, and I'm the Senior Director of Strategy at an organization called MyPath.
Thank you. So just to set the stage for our discussion today, despite being the most diverse group in the nation's history, today's young adults are often viewed as a monolithic group. A detailed look at their financial health tells a different story, though. Join a panel of experts today, myself and the three lovely folks that just introduced themselves to you, and we'll explore the key findings from a recent research paper from the Financial Health Network and GenForward that explores the race, ethnicity, and financial lives of young adults and highlight solutions to dismantle systemic barriers to financial health. Now, we know this is an absolute hectic time in the world, in the history of everything. So we hope that you all can really frame this discussion in the context of the lives we're all living in the 21st century in 2021. And yeah, let's launch this and get this started. So we're gonna have Uzma start by kind of framing the discussion with some of the key findings from the report that GenForward and the Financial Health Network did. And then we'll move into our discussion afterwards. Uzma?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jonathan. All right, so as Jonathan just shared, so I'll be sharing the results of the research study we did last year on race, ethnicity, and the financial lives of young adults. Before I jump into that, for any of you who are unfamiliar with the Financial Health Network, we are a national nonprofit organization whose mission is to improve the financial health of all people in the US, especially those who are financially vulnerable. And we do this through our network of 180 plus companies, most of whom are financial service providers, and as well as carry out original consumer and market research, policy work, consulting services, and provide funding to nonprofits and fintech startups looking to bring innovative ideas to market. And so a little bit about the survey. So as part of our broader consumer research agenda, last year we partnered with GenForward research team, which is housed at the University of Chicago, to conduct some original research exploring the financial lives of young adults through the lens of race and ethnicity. And we chose to focus on this particular topic because far too often young adults are treated as a monolithic group, as Jonathan said, and described with some stereotypes like, you know, millennials could buy a house if they stop spending their money on avocado toast or something like that, or not being as savvy about their finances as generations before them. And so not only are these generalizations really harmful and inaccurate, they also obscure really important differences between young people of different races, ethnicities, and backgrounds, and don't take into context the world that young adults of today have inherited. So we're seeking to kind of unpack that in some of this research. And so on that point, I want to kind of highlight two quick things about the historical context. I'm going to be showing data today, but of course, this is about people and the lives of individuals. And so two quick things I want to highlight. The first is that the results of this study are the result of decades of discriminatory policies and racial capitalism related to housing, education, incarceration, immigration, voting rights that have disenfranchised people of color, particularly Black Americans, since the founding of this country. And the second thing is that the survey was fielded during a really unique moment in time. So it was right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic and just days after George Floyd was killed by a policeman in Minneapolis on May 25th. And so this time period was one of high anxiety for a lot of Americans, but especially for Black Americans. And so we understand that, some of the answers we may have gotten to the survey were definitely influenced by these events, especially those questions of a more subjective nature. And so obviously this history of systemic discrimination is a lot to unpack in just one quick presentation today, but I wanted to bring it up as necessary context for the results that I'm going to share from the survey. And so let's jump in a little bit to our methodology. GenForward is the first of its kind. It's a nationally representative survey that oversamples young people of color to ensure that their voices are represented in research and surveys. And so from May 29th to June 11th of last year, we fielded an online survey to GenForward's panel. And so more than 3,000 young adults between the ages of 18 to 36 completed this survey with large samplings from Black, Latinx, and Asian American populations. And we also did 9 phone interviews with these young adults. And then final note here on some data considerations before I jump into the actual results, a couple of challenges that we may have had. So since the GenForward survey is only offered in English and Spanish, it is likely that our data about Asian Americans both exaggerates the relative success of these young people, while at the same time sharing some important differences by country of origin, immigration status, socioeconomic status, time in the US, et cetera. And so the recent demonstrations that we've been seeing related to stopping AAPI hate have brought a light to for a need to rethink this broad category defined as Asian and consider disaggregating this data in a more thoughtful way. And so that being said, I'll focus less on unpacking the trends for this specific cohort today, but realize it's an important avenue of research for the future. And then the last point I want to make is that we understand that identity is intersectional. And so race and ethnicity are pieces of an individual's experience that interact with other aspects such as socioeconomic status, gender identity, sexual orientation, et cetera. And so the Financial Health Network is committed to exploring these facets in future pulse surveys. But for today, we'll be focusing on race and ethnicity. All right, so let's jump into these findings. So the first thing I want to share with you as an outcome of this research is that we found that on average, Black and Latinx young adults have less liquid savings than their white and Asian American peers. So over 50% of both Black and Latinx young adults say that they do not have enough savings to cover at least 3 months of living expenses. And so without this buffer of savings to draw upon in an emergency, many young adults are forced to resort to other ways to make ends meet, right? Especially in the face of unexpected events. And so a majority of Black young people and a majority of Latinx young people, over 45% each, would be unable to cover a $400 emergency expense, for example. And then the second finding here is that we also found disparities across young adults when it came to debt loads. So Black and Latinx young adults being far more likely to report unmanageable debt. 31% of Black and 28% of Latinx young adults report having more debt than is manageable. And these outcomes are the result of decades of racist and discriminatory lending and housing practices that have denied particularly Black Americans equal access to affordable credit and continue to disadvantage borrowers of color to this very day. And then this quote, I think, really nicely sums up this sort of standstill that young adults have today. So this Black respondent shared with us saying that I want to go back to college, but I can't get more loans than I have. I want to start a job and get a master's, start looking for work, but I just can't. I feel the urge to pay this off, but if I get a job now with what they're paying me, there's no way I can pay off my loans with what I'm making, and I'm kind of at a standstill right now. So we see the effects of this debt trap, right? And where respondents want to go back to college, reluctant to take on more debt, and this kind of tension is something that a lot of young adults are facing today. And then the last finding I want to share with you is about the racial wealth gap. So this enduring racial wealth gap has denied Black and Latinx young adults the ability to build wealth through intergenerational transfers from their family. And we find that Black and Latinx young adults are less likely than white young adults and much less likely than Asian American young adults to say that their family could help them with a large expense, something like college tuition or a down payment for a home. And less than 20% of both Black and Latinx young adults report that their family could help them with these kinds of expenses. And so while I've shared a lot of challenges today, I also want to share this, I guess, silver lining or more positive finding of more than half of young adults across all of these groups are optimistic about their financial futures. And part of this optimism is really centered on the belief that individuals do have the ability to better their condition. And so in fact, GenForward has repeatedly found via their own surveys that even when young adults feel overwhelmingly that the country is on the wrong track economically, socially, et cetera, they are generally optimistic about their own futures. Yeah, and that's all I have for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you laying that groundwork for our panel today. We hope you all enjoyed our key findings. Please go to Financial Health Network's website or the GenForwardSurvey.com to actually download the actual paper if folks want to get deeper into the findings. But let's just start off with folks being able to respond to the findings. How do you see some of the trends identified in the paper that we put together? And this question is for Fahad and Vlad.
Sure. So I can jump in and then hand it off to Vlad. So again, representing an organization called MyPath, which is a national nonprofit focused on increasing wealth building opportunities for BIPOC youth and young adults that are coming from low income and low wealth communities by finding ways to really reduce their financial and economic vulnerability. And that's, one, through individual transformation, skills building, knowledge, access to products, healthy financial products. And then on the other side of the work, it's advocacy and organizing, right, around systems change. And so a lot resonates, I think, in some of the key findings that have been developed here. I know for us and the young people that we partner with, youth of color in general have always had less earning opportunity, less on the dollar, less on the hours, and COVID really amplified this. That's the one big piece over the last year that we've been examining. Youth employment rates from spring 2019 to spring 2020, they jumped from 8.4% to 24.4%, right? It's almost 3 times more. We also know that young people that we're partnering with are expressing that they need access to safe and healthy accounts at a younger age. If you can work when you're 16, why can't you have your own account opportunity? That paired with financial education and learning can set a stronger foundation for you at a younger age. We also feel that it's important to provide access to healthy products. And so partnering with financial institutions to create those access opportunities are really critical too. And so, a lot of those factors I think have led to what we see in the findings that have been kind of uncovered here. And then to dig a little bit deeper, there's a growing movement around the universal basic income, which I'll talk about later in our panel today. And MyPath is working with the only 2 UBI models that are specific to youth and young adults in the country. The number one issue, because we have a pilot in San Francisco, we have a pilot in Santa Clara County. The pilot in San Francisco is partnering with young parenting mothers. And the number one issue, as we kind of examined prior to doing the financial capability supports paired with UBI, was what do you need? What's the most important financial component that's really going to give you some confidence? And what do you need in terms of urgency? And by far, the number one issue was building out an emergency savings plan. Folks are experiencing anxiety. Folks are worried about how they're going to take care of their children. And COVID really amplified that over the past year. And then in Santa Clara, which is some of the older young people that we're working with, young people that are aging out of the foster care system, they're also receiving a universal basic income. Universal basic income means that you don't have a condition in terms of, these extra resources and opportunities. And so we provide financial coaching. And out of the 72 young people that are part of that pilot, 46 signed up. Now that's a big number when you think about folks are busy, there's a lot going on. You don't have to be part of this project. And the number one thing that folks wanted to work on was emergency savings to either pay back debt, build credit, or they're just worried about the instability of the economy. I'll pass it to Vlad.
Yeah, thanks everyone. This has been really interesting so far. I just want to chime in to say that, many of these trends align with the data we've collected at GenForward so far. And just to say a little bit about GenForward, right? Bringing focus and attention to race and ethnicity is really at the heart of our mission at GenForward. Dr. Kathy Cohen at the University of Chicago founded GenForward precisely because there was really no reliable data available on young adults that disaggregated by race and ethnicity, even though these younger generations like millennials and Gen Zers are really the most racially and ethnically diverse generations in American history. So GenForward really tries to fill that need by taking extra steps to ensure that our data are robust and they are as representative as possible, not just of young adults generally, but also within specific racial groups, right? We want to disaggregate by race and ethnicity in order to understand the complexity, the diversity, the nuance of these diverse populations. As far as general trends go, we collect data across a number of issue areas. Of course, we ask about economics and the nature of work. You've seen a little bit of that here today, and I really, really encourage you to download the full report from the Financial Health Network's website because it's just chock full of more insight as well. But we also ask about things like education, immigration, technology, criminal justice, and politics, and other things as well. And consistently, what we find is that there are really important differences by race. Sometimes these differences are what you might expect. Other times they're a little bit more surprising. On the issue of economics, I just want to briefly highlight a couple of things because I want to be respectful of time. The first is that access to capital is really paramount. I think we often hear about the importance of budgeting and savings and education related to financial literacy as being really important levers to pull for this generation. And they certainly are. I don't want to downplay that in any sort of way. But our data really suggests that we should probably zoom out a little bit in this conversation because many young adults, and especially Black and Latinx young adults, don't have access to the jobs that would positively impact their financial health in the first place. So just to give you some concrete numbers, 44% of Latinx Americans and 39% of African Americans report not being able to access good jobs, either because those jobs are unavailable in their particular area or because they can't get to those jobs by driving or using public transportation. So what many young adults report doing instead, and again, I'm specifically talking about Black and Latinx young adults here primarily, is participating in the gig economy. So working for companies like Uber, DoorDash, Instacart, and so on. And that exposes them to vulnerabilities that workers from previous generations didn't necessarily have to worry about, especially if we consider sort of like the shifting dynamics of union membership in the US. And the second and last point I want to make is that issues of economics and financial health are inextricably connected to other aspects of people's lives. This is the one thing that really comes out of our data, is that things like accessing education, giving rising tuition costs and the burden of student loans, or delaying important life milestones like getting married and having children, even caring for aging parents and grandparents, which is actually going to continue to be an issue well into the future, since millennials now are waiting longer to have children. And when they do have children, they typically have fewer children than previous generations. It's going to continue to become a problem. And we know that all of these things sort of merge together to paint a portrait of life for young adults that is sort of marked by inequity and disparity. And as Fahad said, many of these trends have just been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think we're at a really important inflection point moving forward, thinking about how to address some of these things.
Thank you, Vlad. So Uzma, you brought up a pretty heavy term in the introduction when you were describing the historical context of the financial lives of young adults and looking forward to a more healthy future for young adults of color. You talked about racial capitalism very briefly, and it came to mind that a lot of the audience might not be familiar with that term. So I was just curious if folks could respond to how you see racial capitalism showing up today. So racial capitalism, a concept proposed by Cedric J. Robinson, describes the process of extracting social and economic value from people of color throughout history. So it's this idea of you can't really separate race from how capitalism has showed up throughout our history. But can you all respond to that just briefly, because I know the whole panel could be on racial capitalism, but if anything comes to mind that you want to bring up on that topic, just to paint a picture to our audience of how racial capitalism shows up or what racial capitalism is, that would be greatly appreciated. And anyone can jump into that question.
I could jump in real quickly and then hand it off. So I know for some of the young people, when you think about what does this look like, what does this feel like from where I'm from, right? We think about payday lenders lined up on the street, right? Not having access to credit unions. We think about the type of educational opportunities you're getting in school and the type that you're not getting, right? You think about banking culture and a young person walking into a bank and feeling intimidated or not welcomed. I think that to me is like the tip of the iceberg. But I think when I think about storytelling and the young people that we're partnering with, we talk about lack of access to financial information and tools, but it's just the intimidation. It's the bad public policy that for generations has created this cycle of poverty. And I think about for Mission Street in San Francisco, if you're not familiar with it, right? Beautiful area, lively culture, but you can't find a good financial institution out there, right? You find, again, a lot of payday lenders, check cashers, right? And immediately right off the bat, young people are behind the 8 ball when it comes to just what their introduction to what financial capability looks like and what their opportunities and access points are. So, I mean, from our perspective on the ground, I think that's what young people know. Zip codes determine your health, right? And it's a public health saying, right? But it's also connected to the financial mainstream, financial economic mobility. And so I think that's kind of how we think about this and why it's so important to get into policy work and have young people lead those policy efforts. They're experts of their community. They live it, they breathe it, they feel it, they know what the solutions are set to be. And so we need to also think about flipping that script and including them in the conversation.
Go on.
Go ahead, Uzma.
Sorry, yeah. So one thing that Fahad was saying that really, made me think about, other cascading effects. So policy definitely is the core issue. And so one thing that I've seen repeatedly over and over again is where people live has such a huge impact on so many other aspects of their life. And that is directly a policy issue that leads to so many other effects, like segregated schools, for example, like the access to education that you have based on where you live, access to healthy foods, right? There's not grocery stores in some zip codes, right? Access to healthcare, quality healthcare services, right? Access to quality financial institutions and credit lenders and things like that. So I feel like the issue of racial capitalism is just so intertwined as we've been talking about with so many other aspects. You cannot separate the two. And I think that the last year has really created an urgency around that. We're beginning to see it, right? It has existed for so long, but now it's becoming even more evident, and there's a pressing need to address it.
I think that Fahad and Uzma have said just some really wonderful things to clarify the term. I want to chime in to say that oftentimes when we think of American history and sort of the evolution of the American experiment, American society, we think of it as sort of segmented blocks, right? First, there was sort of the American Revolution, and then there was this, and then there was the Civil Rights Movement, right? And so we kind of break them up into units. But another way to think about it is really as sort of a line through time, right? So when we think about racial capitalism, we can go all the way back to the nation's founding on the basis of slavery, right? And how the original sin of slavery in America informed capitalism in the United States. It was based on extracting labor from kidnapped peoples from Africa in the United States, right? And since then, right, public policy has not moved forward in an equitable or an equal way over time. I think that when we talk about the Black experience in the US, right, we can think about slavery and redlining and that sort of historical legacy that we continue to live with through access to food and banking and housing, the way that Fahad and Uzma have mentioned. But we can also think about Latinos in the US, right, how many Latinos in the US are currently and have been used to extract labor from in an agricultural sort of industry, right? In California, now increasingly in the South, in Georgia, and in North Carolina. And so this whole idea about capitalism and labor in the US being just hand in hand with race and ethnicity in the US is really kind of at the heart of racial capitalism and how that's consistently sort of reimagined over time in different ways.
Thank you to all the panelists for kind of digging a little bit deeper into racial capitalism. And I encourage the audience to really look up that term and study that term. It really shapes how American society functions today and really unveils the importance of systemic and institutional racism throughout our history. So on that note of systemic and institutional racism and kind of the time we're living in now, obviously, it's been a little over a year now since everything changed in everyone's lives everywhere across the globe. And what comes to mind on this concept is when we think about the uprising that took place summer of 2020, and maybe another uprising that's about to launch again this summer. But what I understand is that without the pandemic, plus the economic crisis that we experienced due to the COVID pandemic, without both of those things working together, you don't get a 2020 uprising. You needed both of those ingredients, and not just a 2020 uprising, but literally the largest uprising in American history, which is not an easy thing to say aloud. So I'm just curious, how have recent events related to COVID-19 and last year's demonstrations for racial justice shaped progress towards dismantling systemic barriers to the financial health of young adults? And anyone who wants to jump in on that can go.
Yeah, I can jump in just in terms of, again, on the ground, what young people are experiencing right now in terms of who we're partnering with. And like, we think about it like this: many young people and young adults are experiencing their second recession, right? For lack of better words, right? And I think, that's really at this point sparked the energy to start some of this movement building that we're seeing across the country. The young people know that they're not seen, they're not heard, they're not considered in policy making, and honestly, in relief packages that have been going out, right? Are young people really included in there? When we think about unemployment opportunity and benefits, right? Are young people included in that? So even some of the solutions that are taking place right now, it's not inclusive of young people, and they know that, and they're upset about that, and they're hungry to try to find solutions. So again, we forget that young people are experts of their community. They know the conditions. I guess a couple of examples, we think about this basic income, guaranteed income, universal basic income. It started off in Stockton in California, Mississippi, Jackson. It's been a concept, globally that's been happening for a while, in a lot of ways addressing systemic wealth inequity, baby steps, but, some steps, right? And so, went from 2 cities to 35 plus now, right, across the country in terms of exploring this. But again, not so much with a youth frame, right? And we think about kind of prevention-based opportunities, seeding some of this work at an earlier age so that, folks can avoid some of the circumstances, right, that we associate with not having those financial tools and access pieces. And so, that's been one thing that I just, it's been kind of cool to see grow and develop in terms of this basic income piece. And there's been some really good early data from some of the folks that have been doing it in Stockton, and higher employment opportunities, better employment opportunities for those that are in the basic income pilot. So that's one, I think, movement that's rapidly growing that, we feel like, basic income paired with financial capabilities, right? The mentoring, the coaching, the access to products. If we do that with young people, the early adult outcomes are going to be incredible. I think our young people are also really focusing on a couple of core components, educating their peers, this peer-to-peer learning opportunity, right? Not just in terms of financial literacy, but about what's wrong, right? About what needs to be fixed and what do you think needs to happen, right? So that young people are involved in those conversations and they become advocates for their own issues. We have young people also, I think this has sparked young people to join advisory groups and other decision-making bodies. For example, we have some young people in San Francisco that are now working with the Board of Supervisors to address some of the basic income pilots that are starting to pop up there, and how they need to be focused on what type of payment methods, and trying to set this model for other communities to be able to facilitate that process. And then, of course, advocacy. When we think about young people, and there's a lot of good campaigns happening, but for example, a local campaign in San Francisco, young people deserve non-custodial accounts. Again, I know I brought it up earlier, but hey, if you're working when you're 16, why can't you have your own account? And that also sparked a bigger piece for us at MyPath, which is called the Youth Economic Bill of Rights. And so I'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's really this manifesto, if you will, this declaration of what young people deserve, the principles they deserve, and then now the young people at MyPath are connecting with young people across the country to facilitate what are the core policy solutions that you seek, and how can we get there? So again, I'll talk about that later, but hand it off.
Thank you. Let's go to Uzma.
Yeah, sure. So I love this idea that Fahad just brought up of working with young people directly, and the sort of idea of co-creation and like empathy building and all of that. And that really made me think of something that we have at the Financial Health Network, this offering called Finnex. And so what this is a really immersive experience that we offer to companies to build empathy for low and middle income consumers, particularly those who are unbanked and underbanked. And so what we do is we have them go through a series of activities such as cashing a check without a bank account, or interacting with a non-traditional financial institution, such as a pawn shop or something like that. So to get a better experience of like the lived realities of folks. And so we hope that, participating in these kinds of experiences will help companies kind of realize where they fit into this ecosystem. Are they the ones maybe perpetuating some of these issues, and how they can, leave with some action items for improvement, right? And so I think like to go back to Jonathan, your question of like, what are we seeing towards progress of dismantling systemic barriers? So this idea of creating awareness and taking this momentum that's happening right now is like an initial step. And we've seen companies come forward to Financial Health Network, for example, asking, hey, what can we do better? So at least there's like a consciousness around it right now, and like it's important to take seize this opportunity. And we've seen a lot of companies put in monetary contributions to DEI arms, for example. And I know that is an initial step, and we can talk about, how that kind of fits into the larger dismantling of like systemic racism, but it's a first step, and we hope that it's something that can lead to longevity and systemic change.
Thank you, Uzma. Vlad?
Yeah, I'll say, so there's kind of two ways to think about this, or at least two ways that I think about this. One is that, as we've mentioned here in this panel, right, we can think of the pandemic as being a pressure cooker or a stress test, right, with all of these cracks in American society really sort of put on display as a result of the pandemic. And then there's the second part, which is how has that affected how we talk about the issues that plague the US, right? Issues that plague young people, issues that plague people of color, specifically when it comes to economics and the nature of work. And I think what has happened, one of the things that's happened because of the pandemic, is we've really seen kind of a shift in imagination in terms of what are some of the policy options available to us to address some of these things, right? So the fact that that the government has, has given people money, right, just stimulus checks, right, is a really big deal, right, that I don't think gets talked about often enough, right? What are policy solutions that just sort of are based on a cash transfer, right, that says, here you go, here's some money, do something with that, right? There's also all sorts of talks about reimagining education, which is particularly important for younger adults, right? What does education look like? What's the future of education look like now that we have Zoom, now that colleges and high schools across the country have shifted to online formats, right? There's just so much that is being talked about today, right? What is the meaning of infrastructure? How do we define infrastructure? What role do domestic workers and elder care play in infrastructure? It's not just roads and bridges anymore, right? We're trying to think about society in a different way. And I think all of that is partially a result of the pandemic, partially a result of sort of long time organizing by lots of groups and people in American politics and government. And really, I also want to say that, when we talk about young adults, I think that most people's minds typically go to, thinking about 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds. But if we think about millennials, right, the oldest millennials are, around 40, reaching 40 years old. And so millennials are reaching their sort of prime working years and working in places where they can advocate for change. They grew up in a time where they're told, if you play by the rules, you go get an education, right? You are guaranteed some success. But really, we're talking about a generation that for the first time in history is probably not going to do better than their parents' generation, right? And young adults are smart, right? They're aware, they know these things. They've lived over several recessions, as Fahad has said, and they're pushing for change.
Thank you so much, Vlad. I appreciate those words very much so. So this next question is for Vlad and Uzma. Can you talk a little bit about how you've navigated research challenges when it comes to collecting reliable data around race and ethnicity?
Yeah, so I personally am not a data person, but I can talk a little bit about how we're thinking about collecting data going forward at the Financial Health Network. So two things that I think, touched on in the presentation. One was the idea of even rethinking race and ethnicity categories. So for example, this category of Asian, we've seen a lot of discussion recently after violence against AAPI communities of using this as a useful category, right? It kind of obscures some differences, historical legacies and cultural contexts across these groups. And it's kind of like a catch-all, right? So how can we get more sophisticated and specific about this category, right, and parsing this out. So we at Financial Health Network do a nationally representative survey every year called the Pulse, the Financial Pulse Survey. And so one thing that we're doing this year is asking the race or ethnicity question as what is your race or ethnicity? And then allowing respondents to check off multiple options. And we have some expanded options from previous years, such as Middle Eastern, North African, things like that, things that are lumped into other categories or have been lumped into other categories in the past. And then the second point, I think, is a larger point of about intersectional identities, right? And how we're thinking about that as well, and how race and ethnicity has an interplay, right? With gender identity, sexual orientation, and things of that nature. And so we're committed to exploring these to four new areas of race and ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, and disability status, and are trying to write more inclusive questions in our surveys to get at those aspects as well.
Vlad?
First of all, that's really awesome, Uzma. That's really great to hear. There's definitely a need for all of that. So earlier I mentioned that our organization, GenForward, was founded precisely because there is a lack of data on race and ethnicity, especially reliable, high quality data. And in a data-driven world like the one we live in today, right, that often means that people pay less attention to areas where data is scarce, right? So getting good data is really, really important for sort of addressing some of these problems that we face. But collecting data to address those blind spots, and race has traditionally been a pretty big blind spot and continues to be for a lot of organizations, is really hard. It's not easy. The first issue we had to overcome at GenForward was including a big enough number of people in our surveys so that we could draw meaningful inferences from their responses, right? And that's surprisingly harder than it sounds, because conducting surveys is really expensive, right? So that's problem number one, is just having sort of the financial resources available to pursue some of these things, right? They become more expensive when you're dealing with hard to reach populations like younger people, right? Young people are increasingly mobile. They often move residences every year or so. They don't use landlines. They engage with the internet in really sort of specific ways, but ways that evolve, right? As different platforms kind of come on the scene. So we at GenForward, have to get kind of creative about reaching people where they are and take extra steps to make sure those folks agree to participate in our data collection. And I think a lot of organizations don't do that because those sorts of things are only done when race and ethnicity and diversity and inclusion in general is really centered, right? So thinking about the way that your questions are worded, like Uzma said, right? Making sure that they're culturally competent, that they speak to diverse populations, right? Making sure that the people that you talk to are representative of really diverse groups, right? So we like to sort of lump people in, they're white or they're black or they're Latino or they're Asian, but that flattens a huge amount of heterogeneity, right? A huge amount of diversity. Just like Uzma mentioned, these populations aren't monoliths. And so doing things like offering surveys in multiple languages, right? We at GenForward offer surveys in English and Spanish, but that doesn't sort of increase accessibility among Asian Americans in the way that we would like, right? In an ideal world, our surveys would be translated into a whole host of languages, right? And in an ideal world, we would also be surveying and including responses from populations like Native American individuals, right? Multiracial individuals, right? Doing the sorts of things that Uzma mentioned in terms of like really drilling down into these categories to get a better sense of the nuances within them. But there's some really, if it were easy, it would already be done, right? It's really hard to do. It's really expensive to do. And it's not something that you can do without intentionally sort of like designing an approach around these sorts of things, which I think a lot of organizations, unfortunately, just don't do.
So all good things must come to an end. I appreciate all the brilliance of our panelists. Fahad, I do want to close with you. And if you could just go into a little bit more depth and talk about MyPath's Economic Bill of Rights, that would be great.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So yes, our young people, and again, this kind of is aligned with the optimism piece that we talked about before. And then also there's an opportunity, right? With the shifting federal government, right? And hopefully more opportunity within that shift. We think about groups like the Consumer Protection Financial Bureau, CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and some other agencies that really help provide protections for consumers. And that includes young people. Young people are consumers as well. But ultimately, the Economic Bill of Rights has been developed as a way to find effective policy solutions, spotlighting the proper resources, tools, and knowledge that all youth need in order to get on a path of building income and, more importantly, wealth for themselves, for their families, and for their communities. And this group of young people, it's been a fierce group over the past 6 months, been developing the historical context, collecting data at a local, state, federal level, but ultimately are grounded in some core principles in terms of what all young people deserve. So you could kind of think of like, the Declaration of Independence kind of flavor to it. But with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and the devastating economic impact, at the moment, BIPOC youth are transitioning from youth into adulthood. And so they're facing an economic cliff and looming crisis. And what their response to that is investing in youth-centered economic policy solutions will create the necessary resources, tools, and again, knowledge for investing in the present and the future of our young people. And these youth designed economic rights as key pillars to policy recommendations that will prevent generational poverty and build support systems in order to create paths to wealth building. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. The right to a guaranteed income paired with financial education, right? With this growing movement of basic income across the country, there's a huge opportunity to pair that with financial education and financial mentoring and coaching. And we believe that young people should have access to that. The right to a refundable tax credit for young people, expanding the EITC eligibility for young workers. This goes back to the benefits and the resources being provided by the government right now. They're not for young people. And so this is another piece in which young people are saying, well, what about us? And that's one concrete solution. From a broad stroke, the right to a national model for youth banking. What's safe? What's accessible, right? How can young people have account ownership? How do we make sure that the ID piece isn't a deterrent, right? For young people to be able to have access to those things. No overdraft, no nickel and diming, right? Free mobile and online banking. Another piece too that's really important is just the right for young people to understand their credit. So they should have access to their credit reports and theoretically, yes, you can get it, but there's so many barriers for young people to be able to obtain that. And I think about the foster system, right? The foster care system and the impacts there. direct deposit into non-custodial bank accounts, especially if you're a youth workforce agency, you're building the skills of these young people, you're getting them lined up with jobs. What about that missing element of making sure that they have access to direct deposit, right? And they're building healthy financial habits. Financial education from a broad level, the right to financial coaching. I mean, one big one that the young people want to do is understanding the real extent of poverty in this country and really redefining the federal poverty level. I mean, I think it's been a minute, and so it's time to revisit that. And I think our young people are really passionate about bringing that front and center. And I mean, just ultimately, just the right to participate in policymaking. Young people deserve that right. It should be inclusive. There should be opportunities. It shouldn't be tokenized. But really, how do young people become central to the core decision making? How do they add value to their research and storytelling? And ultimately, those are the core components of the Economic Bill of Rights, which we will be unveiling at the Youth Action Hour on April 30th. So that'll mark Biden's 100 days of his presidency. We'll see. We'll give a little measuring stick of how he's doing, and our young people will also be unveiling this Economic Bill of Rights. So thank you for the opportunity to share about that work that they're doing so furiously in their communities.
Thank you, Fahad. Sounds like a great Economic Bill of Rights led by young people around the country, and I'm looking forward to seeing and hearing more. Vlad, Uzma, any final closing thoughts?
I'll jump in and just echo everything that Fahad has said. I think that, in our data, we ask about young people's sort of policy preferences, right? And the things that they would like to see implemented by politicians, both in their local communities, but also at a national level as well. And consistently what we find is support across the board, across racial groups, right? Across just about any way we cut the data, support for really progressive policy implementations, right? Things like addressing student loan debt, things like increasing the minimum wage, things like a wealth tax on the ultra wealthy in the United States. Because at the end of the day, the picture that really sort of emerges from our data is that young people in the US want the same things that everyone in the US has always wanted, right? They want a path to prosperity, to financial security, right? They want a traditional career that offers them those things. And it's becoming increasingly harder to access those things in society, right? Because education is becoming inaccessible and it's expensive. The returns are diminishing for college degrees, right? Home ownership is, the prices are through the roof, right? There are all of these things that are happening that are putting these things out of reach for young people, but young people still want that, right? And so finding creative ways to allow for that to happen is really, I think, the priority moving forward.
That's my final word.
Yeah, sure. So all of the things that we've talked about today, like there's so many opportunities, right? It could be on employment, education, right? There's so many different things that could require reimagining. And I think that that's really the core thing here of there's been like a crisis of reimagining our society, right? And we're at this point now where there's like pressure put on it. The young people are putting pressure on all of us, really, right, to step up and rethink what our world could look like. And so I'm really excited about this moment, and as well as the work that everyone's shared today, and looking forward to it.
On behalf of the Financial Health Network and the GenForward Survey and Black Youth Project, thank you all for joining our panel on race, ethnicity, and the financial lives of young adults. We look forward to working with you all, building with you all, organizing with you all from now into infinity and beyond. We have a lot of work to do, everyone. Thank you. Hello, everyone. We're real. We are real people in real time at this moment. My name is Jonathan Likes. You all just saw the wonderful brilliance of our three panelists. So we're going to jump right into some questions we have coming in. We have about 5 or 10 minutes for questions. So if there are any lingering questions on your mind, please send those in now. but we actually have one already that came in. The question is, what's a good model of financial education for young people you might recommend or see as a good model? And we'll just allow everyone to jump in on that one.
So I can go ahead and kick it off. It's great to have everybody here in this space, and we hope you found the presentation informative. Again, my name is Fahad with MyPath, and I think it's a great question, and there's a lot of models out there. I'll just say, frankly, I think there's a lot of research to sift through to determine what are the best ones, and it really depends on the different populations and I guess the different communities we're serving, and also age populations. Like that definitely tremendously makes an impact. But I think from a broad level, knowledge obviously is very important. You know, we talk about the educational aspect, traditional financial literacy, but it has to be more than that. When we think about financial education, I think a better term to think through is financial capability. And so when I think of financial capability, or when MyPath thinks of that, it's that education, the knowledge, but it's really the access to the products too. It's one thing to talk about in theory, this is what's going to happen in theory, this is what a checking account is, and if you do this right, then in 3 years you'll have access to this, versus doing it live. And that needs to happen in partnership with financial institutions. And traditionally, financial institutions, whether it's the bottom line, it's return on investment, have shied away from offering quality products to young people. But in order to really cultivate the next generation of consumers, of healthy financial consumers, it's important for folks to think that. And so a lot of the credit unions we've been partnering are providing access to those types of products, and the ability to practice is really key. And then when we think about the different segmentations, the reason why the question's a little bit tricky is because we know that, the age population, when it comes to you hitting high school, you're 16 years old, you want to work, you have an opportunity to work, but there aren't really accounts in place for you. So you're probably going to go to a check casher to check your, to cash your check. And that's a missed opportunity. So like that basic education is really informative of just the basic outline of a checking account, the impacts of a payday lender or a check casher, versus when you're with some of the young people we're working with, particularly in the foster youth system, who are very savvy, who have navigated a system on their own, who are a little bit older now, who have had accounts, who have had cash come in. They're thinking about wealth building opportunities. So they're thinking about building my credit so I can get a car loan. I'm building my credit so I can, get a down payment for a home. These type of conversations are happening. So it's a big spectrum. And I think a lot of it depends on the assessment, right? And the data. So leveraging the data that we see, and then developing a curriculum to really respond to it. But those three components of knowledge, access, and practice are really important.
Thanks so much, Fahad. Let's go to Vlad.
Hey, everyone. Glad to be here. Thanks for the questions. I want to reiterate something that Fahad already said, which is that education is, of course, important, but access to capital is even more important, right? Everyone knows that they should be saving money, but it's hard to do when you're under crushing levels of student debt, right? Student loan debt, or when you are working in a gig job like an Uber driver or a DoorDash delivery person or something like that. You just don't have the money to save. And so while I think that there's a lot that we can do in terms of educating people around, what's the difference between a Roth IRA versus a traditional IRA? Where do you invest if you do have access to some sort of retirement account or something like that? The difference between low cost versus high cost funds, all of that, sure, definitely. But it's going to mean very little if people don't actually have the access to money in order to do those things.
Thank you, Vlad. So we have another question that came in, super intriguing question to me. It states, do you believe the rise of cryptocurrency will have positive effects on the finances of young adults? How could it go right, or how could it go wrong? I love this question, and I love the potential of cryptocurrency. I think anytime that we're decentralizing power from a Federal Reserve Bank, I think we're moving in the right direction. There are also some interesting case studies with Akon starting a city that will be totally based on cryptocurrency in West Africa. I think there's a lot of potential in this world, particularly with subcultural groups being able to build up their own agency. Uzma, do you want to kind of jump in on this question?
Yeah, sure. I think this question, what it really gets at that you were talking about, Jonathan, is sort of the perceptions, right? Like, what is cryptocurrency standing for, right? It kind of highlights that the favorability of cryptocurrency amongst young adults sort of highlights that perhaps there's some mistrust, right, with our current financial system and how young people are viewing their relationship with money and with the government, honestly. So I remember there were some stats that I saw that I think it was around a third of young people prefer cryptocurrency over stocks, gold, like traditional bonds, like these kinds of more traditional financial service products. And so when we saw recently as well with the GameStop fiasco, with the GameStop stock fiasco of how the market was manipulated artificially, and the backlash that we saw on Reddit, right, from young people saying like, hey, like this is like happening before our eyes and it's unfair, right? So in terms of the effects that cryptocurrency will have, I'm no market expert, but I think it is a reclaiming of power and agency over their wealth, right? And so I'm hoping that it will lead to more and more positive financial health for young people. Yeah.
Vlad?
Yeah, I 100% agree with all of that. I also want to point out that there's a lot of things that are related here, right? So there's a mistrust in the system that is rooted in something. And part of what that's rooted in is a generation of people who have been told, if they go to college, if they take out student loans, if they do the right things, they'll have access to high-paying jobs and social mobility and a future that's better than their parents' and their grandparents' generation. And so many millennials have done this, right? It's the most educated generation we've seen, and yet those returns just aren't there, right? And so what happens when people play by the rules and are told that they're going to get certain things for playing by those rules, and those just aren't there, right? The jobs aren't there, the wages aren't there, the ability to buy homes isn't there. That's when you start seeing, some of these more creative solutions, some of these attitudes where people have some preferences towards crypto, which I think is really exciting and interesting. But also, when we're talking about the future of people and the financial health of people, right? A lot of times, these crypto schemes, like investing in Doge when it's at 72 cents or whatever the case might be, it's really speculative. It's some people are going to get rich off of it, and some people are going to lose everything. So I think that it would be nice if we had something a little bit more stable for people to engage with.
Absolutely. Thank you for the nuance, Vlad and Uzma. All right, last question before we close this panel. The question says, what are some policy or system changes we can advocate for to make access to capital and wealth building more equitable, particularly when thinking of LMI young adults who don't have access to a financial safety net or assistance from family?
So I can jump in real quick because we do have a Bill of Rights that is out now. So I'm happy to say that it's gone through the design format. Our young people took about 6 to 8 months developing this Bill of Rights, which focuses on the core principles that all young people deserve to be healthy and thriving in all ways. I think some of the ones that pop off related to this question, especially when you think about young adults, that kind of being the key spectrum, is like this concept of a guaranteed income that's been going on around the country, like, to Vlad's points of like capital and providing dollars and cash. I think it's important that we continue to examine, fund, pilot these type of opportunities specifically for young adults in the foster youth space, young parenting mothers. But there's a lot of groups out there that I think, given this opportunity, can take advantage of it, addressing either debt issues or using it to thrive and really build their financial capability. So that's one piece that comes up. Another one is the right to be eligible for the earned income tax credit. I think as working people participating in the nation's economy, young people, obviously make up a big kind of workforce when it comes to that. They've been hit the hardest too when it comes to COVID. But many are, they're exempt from the eligibility due to the dependency status and being under the age of 24. And so I think that's another opportunity to examine in terms of putting more capital into young people's pockets, which is really important. And then two more that kind of come into mind out of the 9 policy-driven recommendations that our youth developed is just financial coaching and access to that, especially for the young adults. When you start thinking through the different products, credit building opportunities, questions around crypto, IRA, investment, home ownership, and really like moving into a wealth building opportunity where, you know, especially if they're first generation in the country, you know, those types of things are really important for them to navigate, and having access to a quality financial coach / mentor is really critical. And we've actually done some work in pairing that with basic income. That's been really effective. And then finally, when it comes to policy making, young people need to be part of the process. So I think that's just like a kind of a general statement where I know fundamentally those are the most impacted, have the solutions in many ways, and obviously have access to data and other things too, to stories that are really important. And so it's important to include young people when it comes to those types of decisions that are being made at a federal, state, and local level.
Anyone else want to add in on this?
I can add one more thing, which is one of the most influential or powerful policy changes that we can make right now that would impact the financial health of young adults is to cancel, or at the very least minimize, student loan debt. And I know that when people say that, we typically have this image in our head of somebody who went to a liberal arts college or has a good degree or something like that. But that's not really the person that is graduating with a lot of student loan debt. Oftentimes, people who have student loan debt don't even graduate, right? These are typically people, young adults, disproportionately of color, who attend for-profit institutions that they never graduate from. And their student loan debt isn't, you know, massive, but it balloons to become a really massive problem. And so canceling student loan debt would absolve them of that debt and allow them to sort of move forward in a way that could allow them to maybe build some wealth, right? So I think that right now, that one policy change would have really powerful implications for all sorts of other things that Fahad already mentioned, in terms of, you know, how do we make home ownership a little bit more accessible? How do we make an income and sort of increase in wages more accessible and things like that? I think that getting people out of debt would also be a really important step that we can take.
Any final thoughts, Uzma? Oh, you're on mute. Nope. Maybe your headphones died. It's okay. Nope. It's okay. It's okay. Well, this has been the Just Economy panel, conference panel on race, ethnicity, and the financial lives of young adults. We want to...
Sorry.
Oh, there you go.
Okay.
Did you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, tech is a blessing and a curse. My AirPods literally just died. So yeah, I'm so sorry about that. The last thing, I was just going to underscore what Vlad just mentioned about the student loan debt. We know that, you know, once somebody has one kind of debt, it's related to other types of debt as well. It's like a cascading problem. And also, it's such an easy problem to solve as well, right? Like in terms of like, you literally could just cancel it all, right? And when we look at the stats of how much debt folks have, it's also in such nominal amounts. Like I work in healthcare. I know that medical debt, like the amount that folks usually have in medical debt collections is around $700, like could easily be canceled with a pen stroke, right? So it's frustrating to see that kind of information and then realize that our government officials, our legislators have the power to change it. So yeah.
Thank you. Once again, we appreciate everyone for joining us on this panel. Please feel free to reach out to us, and we look forward to building with you all and struggling with you all in principled struggle moving forward as we work together to build a better world. Thank you, everyone. You have a good one.